Hi, and welcome to the 2021 Esri Developer Summit. This presentation is going to be about getting started with hosted feature layer webhooks. My name is Peter Klingman. I am a product advocacy lead on the ArcGIS Online team. So let's imagine this scenario together. Let's say that you work as a city planner for the city of Sunny Glen, Oregon. You have a small team of colleagues, and one of the ongoing projects is to examine recent imagery and parcel information to identify parcels that would be good candidates for purchase to augment the city's open space. The participants work on this project when they have spare time, just by adding candidates in a feature layer. As the planner in charge of the project, you need to be aware when a parcel is added so that you can review it. And you also have to keep track of the parcel ID and zoning type of the candidates. However, your organization does not own the feature layers that have this data. This sounds like quite a lot of effort on your end, but with feature layer webhooks and a webhook provider, the notifications and attribute updates can be automated, saving you a lot of time and ensuring that you're notified of changes and that the parcels are promptly and accurately attributed with the parcel ID and zone type. Let's talk about webhooks briefly. Webhooks are user-defined HTTP callbacks. I like to think of these as a way of passing real-time information from one service to another. So in our case, we will be passing real-time information from the ArcGIS Online feature service to Integromat, which has a module to receive this information and pass it through automated workflow steps. The first step of the workflow is to create a hosted feature layer and a hosted feature layer view. Let's go ahead and get into it. So here I have the feature layer that I have created for my editors that are participating in the project to add candidate sites. So a couple things that we need to keep in mind here. We need to make sure that the only type of editing that is allowed is adding features. So that is configured in the feature layer settings. So right here we have only adding features. The other thing that I want to call attention to is this editing setting, keep track of created and updated features. This is also known as change tracking, and we can see here that this is enabled. Currently this checkbox is not changeable because my hosted feature layer view also uses this setting. So once it's configured on the hosted feature layer, views will also have this enabled. But you must check this setting on to see the option to create a webhook, because webhooks rely on change tracking to know which changes are made and which ones to send to the webhook scenario. So now let's go to the hosted feature layer view created from this layer that is for the city planner use of the layer. So in this scenario, this is you that will be reviewing these parcel selections. So if we look at this hosted feature layer view, we can see that in the editing settings, all types of edits are allowed. This is because you, as the reviewer, will be going through the parcel candidates and potentially deleting them if they're bad selections, or updating the status of the selection in its review process. And you'll also be automating some of these updates to the attributes through the webhook provider. So it's really important that all three types of editing are allowed. The next step is to define editable attributes, permissions, and set the style and pop-ups on both the hosted feature layer and view. So I'm back in my hosted feature layer that will be used for members of my organization to edit, and it's important that it's shared with the organization. And another thing that we need to do is make sure that the zoning and parcel ID columns are not editable in this layer. They will be editable in the hosted feature layer view, but from the Fields tab, you'll want to go in and ensure that this value right here for editable is no for both the attributes that you don't want this specific group to be editing. And the reason for this is that as part of the automated workflow in Integromat to update attributes, you'll be adding in these values, and you'll be doing it in a way that is guaranteed to be accurate. I've also configured the pop-up in the visualization tab to only show the status attribute. This, of course, is up to however you want to configure your project, but I made this choice because I didn't want to create any confusion about empty parcel ID and zoning attribute fields when my editors are adding the candidate points. Now that we have our hosted feature layer and hosted feature layer view set up, we can add them to web maps and add some reference information that's publicly available on ArcGIS Online. So this is the item details page of the hosted feature layer that my editors will add candidate sites to. So I'll click the drop down and open it in Map Viewer Beta. And I'll go ahead and add a parcels layer and a zoning layer. These are provided by the City of Eugene publicly on ArcGIS Online. So let's go ahead and add this one right here. And we'll also add I've gone ahead and made some different symbology choices to make the parcels transparent, so the individuals adding features can see what the terrain looks like underneath. And I've symbolized the zoning layer with parks, open space, and public land, so that those choosing potential sites can potentially pick areas that are adjacent to open or publicly accessible land that the city already owns. I did this with an arcade expression that looks at the zone code. If the zone code is agriculture, public land, natural resource, or parks and open space, the value returned is parks, open space, and public land, and it's symbolized with that transparent green. If the zone code is not any of these here, then candidates is returned because these are all zones that could possibly be purchased or converted into parks, open space, or public land. I've also configured an admin version of the map for viewing the parcels that looks essentially the same. Now that we've created two web maps and added reference layers, we can create a scenario in Integromat and add the Webhook module. Integromat provides a service that integrates a lot of different services across the web, lets them interact with each other, and enables you to automate workflows. So this is laid out through scenarios. Here I am on the scenarios tab of my Integromat account, and I can choose to create a new scenario. In the first component that I will add to this scenario is a webhook. So I'll go ahead and search for that. And I see that right here, and I can add my webhook. And we'll just use the custom webhook. Let's go ahead and go in here to set the module up, and we will add a new webhook. We'll just call this Dev Summit Webhook. And it gives us this URL. So this URL designates where the data from ArcGIS Online will be sent when the webhook is triggered. So we need to copy this, and we'll use this as the hook URL parameter when setting up our webhook. Now that we have created this scenario and the webhook module in Integromat and obtained the hook URL, what we can do now is create the feature service webhook from the service's REST admin URL. So let's go ahead and get into that. So here we are on the item details page of the hosted feature layer that will be used for the other members of the project to add new parcels for conservation. So we want to create a webhook that listens for new ads and then sends that information about the added feature to Integromat, specifically to that URL that we obtained in the previous step. So let's go ahead and view the service URL. And then what you'll need to do is insert the word admin between REST and services. So your service URL will read arcgis/rest/admin/services. So we can see that right here, REST admin services. We'll go to that URL, and you can tell you're on the admin endpoint when you see this pink bar at the top of the page. And let's go ahead and scroll to the bottom, and we can see we have this webhooks option here. Let's select that, and let's create a new webhook. So this name can be anything. Let's call it Ads Dev Summit. And we're only going to listen for features created. This is the wildcard for all change types. This is create, updated, and deleted. But we only want ads. The full list of options is available in the REST API documentation. And for the hook URL, we will paste in the URL that Integromat gave us for the webhook module. We'll leave the payload format as JSON, change it to active, and 20 seconds is okay. So then we can go ahead and say create. And sometimes it gets created with active as false, and in that case we can just go in and edit the webhook and change that to true. And now we can see that it's active. We have our URL that goes to the Integromat scenario, and we're ready to get going with sending information about added features to our automated scenario. So I'm back in Integromat after finishing setting up the webhook on the hosted feature service. So let's go ahead and take a look at what everything looks like that I've added here. So this is the Webhooks module where we got the hook URL to add to the hosted feature service webhook. So we can see that here. We determined the data structure, which is just the payload that is sent from the hosted feature service webhook. So we can look at what that is in the JSON module. So I've set up the JSON module to parse JSON. Essentially what parsejson does is looks at the key value pairs in your JSON object and gives you access to those values dynamically. So you can just add the key to your data structure. So let's go ahead and look at what the keys in the payload are. So we have all of these keys right here, and we have the data type. So each webhook payload that comes through, parsejson will allow us to specify in subsequent modules that we want to access the value at this key. So let's say, okay. So now if we look at the email module, we can see that we have access to all of the values that are sent over in the webhook payload. And one of those values is the changes URL, which is the entry point for a series of requests that will give us attribute values of the feature that was added. So if we look in here, we can see that I can choose to add the name. This was the name of the webhook that we created in ArcGIS Online, the layer ID, the org ID, service name, last updated time. This might be useful for your workflow, as well as the changes URL. So just to see what the changes URL and subsequent URLs look like from the hosted feature service side of things, I've only chosen to send the changes URL to myself. And we'll go ahead and see what that looks like after I make an edit. So let's say OK, and we'll run this once. And I'll go over to my web map and I'll make an edit. So I'm just adding a point. Remember, the webhook is only listening for ads. So I've added that point, and we go back to Integromat, and we're listening for new data at this point. So the webhook's listening, and the webhook sends every 20 seconds. So we should expect that it will pick up that new ad shortly. Okay, great. So I'll go ahead and grab the link from my email, and we can see what the changes URL looks like. So here's the email that I sent to myself from our test scenario. And if I select this, then we get a token required message. And the reason is that this is a feature service that is not shared with everyone. It's shared with the organization. So we need a server token to access this service. For now, I'll just go ahead and append one to the end of the URL, but we'll cover in Integromat how to use OAuth to generate a server token to send these requests. With a valid token added as a parameter to the query string, we can see the extract changes endpoint. So this is the URL that the webhook sends to us, and then we have to know what to do with it. We can see that extract changes returns a status URL. When we select this status URL, we can see that the status is completed. We get a response type and a few timestamps. And from the status URL, we can access attribute information about the ad from this result URL. And this downloads a JSON file. And if we open up this JSON file, we can see specific information about the feature that was added. So for example, we have the geometry right here. We have the X and the Y coordinates in Web Mercator. We have the attributes, so the object ID, global ID, creation and editing information right here, and we have the status that was added. And notice this parcel ID and zoning field are currently null because we prevented editing in the hosted feature layer of these two fields. And notice also that we have the updates array is empty, and same with delete IDs, that this array is empty too. And we don't have any attachments on this hosted feature service, so the adds, updates, and delete IDs attachments arrays are also empty. But this is the attribute information that we'll be drilling down into through Integromat. Now that we understand where to obtain the attributes, we can go ahead and build out the rest of the scenario in Integromat. Let's take a look at each step in that process. In the first scenario, I showed the Webhooks module that receives the webhook payload and parse JSON to extract the changes URL. But as we saw, the changes URL for a private feature service requires a token. So how can we obtain that token? Integromat provides an HTTP module where you can make an OAuth2 request. So let's open that up and see what that looks like. So we can see I have my online OAuth connection here. And in Integromat, you can go into your connections and take a closer look at what that looks like. So let's open that up and take a look at some of those parameters. So to see this in action, I'll create a new connection. So here I am in my new scenario, and I can search for the HTTP module, select it, and then choose Make an OAuth2 request. And we can see it's already filled with my previous connection. But what I can do is I'll add a new connection, and we'll call this dev7 connection. I'm using an authorization code, so when this request is initially sent, Integromat will kick open a new window for me to input my ArcGIS Online username and password. After I input those, then the connection is saved and I can reuse it without storing my credentials anywhere in the flow in plain text. So the authorized URI and the token URI can be obtained from Esri's documentation. In this case, it's sharing rest OAuth2 authorize, and the token is sharing rest OAuth2 token. And the scope we want to add is browse. And for the client ID and client secret, you'll need to register an app in ArcGIS Online. So let's take a look at what that looks like. To add an application from your content page in ArcGIS Online, select Add Item and then an application. And you can fill out, so for the URL, we can just say Integromat, fill out the title, and add the item. And once you've added the item, you can register it. When you register the app, you have to specify the redirect URI. The redirect URI is where the authorization code will be sent upon successful authorization. Integromat provides a redirect URI that we can use. They require that you use this redirect URI, integromat.com/OAuth/CB/OAuth2. And you can take your app ID and app secret from here and use those as the client ID and client secret in Integromat. So we'll say client ID, client secret, and we'll also need to show the advanced settings here because we want to make sure that the token is in the query string and called token. And the reason for this is that if we remember when we accessed the extract changes URL manually, ArcGIS feature services include the token in the query string. So this is everything we need to create the connection. When I select continue, it kicks open the familiar ArcGIS Online sign-in screen, and I can sign in, and this finishes the connection. Now I can make any request that I want that requires a token, and the token parameter will be automatically appended to the end of that URL. So back to our scenario, we make a request for the changes URL through the OAuth connection, and along with the format of JSON, a token is appended to that URL, and this will return the status URL. So using parsejson to parse the data JSON string using extract changes, we can obtain the status URL. And after we obtain the status URL, so we can see that right here is the output of parsejson, we need to use the sleep tool in Integromat. The sleep tool will delay the next request for a certain number of seconds. So all we're doing here is delaying the next HTTP request for the result URL for 15 seconds. The reason is that the result can take anywhere between, in my experience, 5 and 15 seconds to generate. So, and if you're generating an even larger result, say you have a lot of complex geometry, for example, you may need to increase this to a higher value. And I'll show that in action here in a second. But so we delayed this request, and now we're going to query the status URL. And the status URL will give us the result URL. So let's take a look at this. Again, just putting in the status URL that we've obtained from parsing that out of the result of the extract changes URL. So out of the status URL, we will again choose to parse that JSON, and here we have the result URL. Let's take a look at what we're obtaining from that. And here we're going to get the result URL, response type, the status, so this will be completed or pending, and by using the sleep module, we ensure that this status will be completed. So if you recall, the result URL is a JSON file, and the HTTP module in Integromat to get a file doesn't enable sending an OAuth2 request. So we have to make an OAuth2 request here for a server token using the generate token method with the service URL passed into the server URL parameter. We'll parse the token and then append that to the result URL to obtain the JSON file. We'll make sure that the encoding is in UTF-8 using the Integromat Tools module. And from there, we'll again parse the JSON. It's important to understand your data structure and configure this parse JSON module to reflect your attributes in your feature service. So let's take a look at what that looks like for mine. So let's choose the edits array, and we'll go into the features array right here. And I'm focused specifically on ads because this webhook is configured for ads only. So let's open up the specifications here, and we notice that this comes in as two different items in an array. And we have the geometry and the attributes. And here, I've specified my object ID, my global ID, and so on for all the attributes that are in my feature service. And for my geometry, it's come in as X and Y, which will likely be the same for yours. And we can see what the output of that looks like. So it comes in as this JSON string, which is the result URL, and it parses out the ads. So I can see my X and my Y geometry, and I can see all of my attributes right here. We can see the status of new. This was a feature that was edited just a little bit ago. So we can now reference these values dynamically in subsequent modules, and they will pull from the most recent edit coming through in the webhook payload. Now that we have our attributes from the recently added feature available to Integromat, it's up to us what we want to do with them. So if you recall the scenario, we are using two public layers for zoning and parcel information. And we want to obtain the parcel ID and the zone type and add that to our candidate feature layer. So we can do that completely through modules within Integromat. So let's run through what that looks like. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to make another request. And this time we are going to query the parcels layer. And when we query it, we're going to pass in the X and the Y value from our added feature as the geometry parameter. We'll also specify the spatial reference of Web Mercator and intersects as the spatial relationship type. And notice we're also not going to return geometry and only asking for the map tag slot, which is the parcel ID, outfield. And the reason for this is that this is the only information that we need to ultimately add back to the candidate feature. So we'll parse the JSON and again, understanding the response that's coming back and making sure that we choose the attribute that we need. In this case, that is only that map tag slot attribute right here. And we'll do the exact same thing for the zoning feature layer. Again, passing in the X and Y value from the candidate feature that was added as geometry, and only requesting back that zone name field. And again, we'll parse out the zone name field from the response. So now what we can do is make an update features request to the admin view of the feature layer. And this is a post request. So the parameters that we need to pass in are the features parameter, and that includes an attributes object with the object ID, global ID, parcel ID, and zoning value. We're pulling our parcel ID from the output of the query request for the parcels feature layer based on the XY geometry. And then we're pulling the zoning value from the output of the query request for the zoning feature layer based on the geometry of the candidate point. And we're taking the object ID and the global ID from the candidate point that was added by one of our editors. So this way we're making sure that the value for the parcel and the zone type that intersects that feature that's been added is added to the accurate feature in the feature layer. And you can also see here, since this is not a publicly editable layer, we do need a token, and we can reuse that token that we obtained when we called generate token in that HTTP make an OAuth2 request module. These numbers stand for the numbers of the modules, so we can reuse the output from that. And this is just the JSON that was parsed to get us that token. And we can see the output of that here. We get the updated results with our object ID and global ID, and that the success was true. And now what we can do is send the result to us, the admin, through an email. So I've composed an email using some of the dynamic content. The subject includes the parcel ID that we've added to our feature layer. And the body includes the parcel ID, the zone type, and I've also used URL parameters with map viewer beta to center the web map on the new point that's added. And this will make it really easy for me or you or whoever's reviewing these candidate selections to click on the link. It opens the web map right away to that point that's been added, so that the administrator can review or analyze or dig into that addition in whatever way is necessary very easily. So let's go ahead and say OK here, and to test a scenario in Integromat, here's the entire thing. What you can do is select run once. So my scenario isn't on right now. I don't want to incur too many scenario runs on my free Integromat plan. But to test it out, you can say run once, and now it's waiting for an edit or an add to that hosted feature layer. So let's open up the map where the editors are making edits, and we can look around for a parcel that might be a good candidate for conservation. I can see the existing open space here. Looking around, I've already selected quite a few possible ones. Okay, this is intriguing right here. This looks like a good candidate. I don't see a house here. So I'll go ahead and select that. The status is new, and I've added it. So you can see that right here. And remember, this is the editor's map. So let's go back to Integromat. Still waiting on that scenario. We need to give it up to 20 seconds for the webhook to send the payload to this module and start the scenario. So now the sleep module is running, and what's happening here is we're waiting for 15 seconds for that result URL JSON file to be generated. Okay, so the scenario completed, and I'll check my email here in a second. I've received an email. So let's pretend that I'm the admin reviewing the selections. All I have to do is click on the link in my email, and it takes me right to that point that was added. And if I select that point, I can actually see that the parcel ID and the zoning has been added. So automatically, right after my editors add that point, the webhook and subsequent scenario that we've set up handle parsing through the URLs and extracting the attribute information, and also querying two public feature layers for intersecting attributes and updating the added feature with those relevant attributes. So it's going to make life a whole lot easier for me reviewing these selections. Thanks for digging into Hosted Feature Service webhooks with me today. I hope this presentation illuminated how Hosted Feature Service webhooks could automate or augment the workflows in your organization. Let me know what you thought of this session by clicking the survey link. Thanks again.